G'day YouTubers, just making a quickie video. Mates around for some pre-drinks and we're about to go out clubbing to the edgy. Hey guys, I'm going clubbing. Fuck that. Got far more interesting things to do than piss around with idiots. Oh no, what will they think? You can't keep me locked up forever. Eventually something's gotta give. I have control. I won't let them know. You guys can STFU because the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. What we're actually going to do is an Issues in Neuroscience video tonight. I'm going to ask a rather simple question of neuroscience, but I'm afraid it can't answer my question. My question is, do we have free wills? It's simple to ask, but it's definitely complex to answer. Just so we're on the same page, I'll be defining free will as internal control over our actions and our decisions, and we'll be looking specifically at behaviour. Studying free will can also be dangerous territory because of its consequences. Whether or not we have free will may affect how we think about the law. Think about insanity pleas. Basically, an insanity plea is claiming you had a lack of free will. On the other hand, some people claim drug use or alcohol use as an excuse to a crime, but that's not taken into consideration because it said that it was your choice to take that substance and lose control. Now, Freud aims to explain these internal drives we have towards our actions and behaviours. He was well known for the theory of the id, superego and the ego. The id is basically the pleasure drive, so it's hedonistic, takes, how can you gain the maximum pleasure out of everything without regard for the consequences. On a complete opposite to that, you have the superego, who takes into account moral responsibility and social and things like that, disregarding how much pleasure you can get or any other circumstances. In between those two, you have the rational ego, who tries to work things out between the two. So, like before, you could say you had the superego there, trying to impress people and worrying about social standing. Then you had the id, who doesn't really care and just wants to have fun. And the ego, who is trying to compromise. And the ego is me. Mental illness happens when the ego becomes overburdened by the id and the superego, but it tries its best to use its defences of things such as denial, repression, etc. That was Freudian theory. Then we go into the future and we look at Skinner and his behaviourism. Then along comes Skinner and the behaviourists and says to Freud, disregard all that internal rubbish. It's all about external influences on our behaviour. We get external and then we produce behaviour. Internal, it's an illusion. Yes is a scientific term. The theory is here that consequences control our behaviour. There's something called operant conditioning. So that's when you do a behaviour and you're either rewarded or punished for it. If you're rewarded, you are more likely to do the behaviour next time, and if you're punished, you are less likely to do the behaviour. So it's all about consequences. There's also a type of conditioning Pavlov came up with, classical conditioning. So that's when you associate two stimuli together and eventually get an unconditioned stimuli to produce a response. For example, if you get a rat and you give an electric shock and you make a noise at the same time, it'll come up with a fear response, because ouch, electric shock equals a fear response. Now, if you do that for a while, then you take away the electric shock and only make the sound, it will still make a fear response to the sound. That's called fear conditioning. It's what I'm interested in, because the amygdala is involved. So the clinical applications that classical and operant conditioning have is a possible explanation of how phobias work. So you've got the example of little Albert, a baby who was experimented on, a bit controversial. They got him a white rabbit or a white rat or something, and at the same time they banged some syllables behind his head, which scared the shit out of the baby. Eventually they produced a phobia in little Albert. So forget all Freud's or fucking your mother kind of theories he came up with. No, it was just operant and classical conditioning. Now, that's behaviourism. How it relates to free will? Actually, let's get the man, let's get Skinner to answer that for us.
Where does that leave free will? Because we all think we have a choice whether to do things or not to do things.
Yes. Well, you see, it leaves it in the position of a fiction. We have assumed somehow or other that these internal states, feelings, and so on have initiated something. They have started something. They have created. We have done something in a voluntary way. We have willed to act. If you now look at the actual history, we find that there are external reasons why this has happened. In other words, by discovering the causes of behavior, we can dispose of the imagined internal cause. We dispose of free will as an American divine of the 18th century, Jonathan Edwards, did. He said, we believe in free will because we know about our behavior, but not about its causes. And of course, it's the object of a science of behavior to discover causes. And once you have found those causes, there is less you need to attribute to an internal act or will, and eventually, I think, we need to attribute nothing to it.
Yeah. Shut up now, Skinner. Okay, my turn now. Now, people had a few criticisms of the way Skinner thought. For example, basically Skinner thought that you couldn't really test internal states and cognition, and the cognitive scientists didn't really like this one bit. And basically, if you can't test something, it doesn't mean it's not there. Because maybe in the future, like now, some new technology and new ideas might just come along and be able to test something that was once untestable. I mean, a lot of behaviourism makes sense. I mean, it partially might explain why people take drugs or why people gamble. You know, they've been conditioned from the reward. But it's not the entire story. Take, for example, training lab rats. That sort of Skinner training is done often as part of neuroscience cognitive behavioural tests. But if it was true that it was only external factors controlling your behaviour, then in that case you'd find that each and every rat would respond the same way. Why? Because science is very particular in its experiments, and this is a bit of a controversy because it's not natural, this isn't how the world works. But in experiments you do something the same every single time. So if you're testing the effect of a drug on some behaviour, the only thing you change is the drug between each condition to keep everything the same. Room temperature, colour of the room, the same room, talk the same way. Okay, maybe not that particular, but anything that you change can confound the results. But yet you see each rat behaves differently. There's just too many factors. Different attention, different motivation, time of day. Everyone has a different circadian rhythm. Genes, reactions occurring in the body at that particular time. All of these may be adding up to produce a behaviour. It's not as simple as consequences only. You know, the rat will do this for a reward. The rat might do this for a reward, but maybe it's not hungry at the moment, or it's too sleepy, so it won't do it for the reward. It will prefer to sleep instead, because sleep. This is called emergent behaviour theory. So basically there's a lot of factors which cause a certain behaviour, a lot of simple factors. But the fact that it's impossible currently to measure every single factor is given an illusion of free will. So it's not really free will. If we were able to measure everything, we would be able to predict the behaviour, so it's deterministic. Like, let's start with something that's not got to do with behaviour. Picture me playing a role-playing game, True 20, and I want to make an action and I have to do a dice roll of a d20 dice, a 20-sided dice. I roll and I roll a natural 20, so I score 20 on the dice. And this is said to be a random event. Random is defined as something having an equally likely chance of being picked. So I have the same chance as rolling a 1 as making a critical strike of a 20. Did I get lucky, or could I have predicted it? Well, emergence theory says yes, because if we take into account every single factor, let's say the muscles that you have in place, the position of them before you roll a 20 controls how the dice rolls. The air pressure, the temperature, anything, the resistance of the ground. You could go on and on and on and come up with factors that cause you to roll that 20. But because we can't label every single factor, it is thought to be a random roll of 20. Now, that's a dice. There are 20 likely outcomes. For our behaviour, I would say the amount of behaviours we can do is infinite. I'm not sure on the exact number on it. It probably isn't infinite. It might be a finite number. But I have a life and I'm not going to calculate it. So, if free will is an illusion, is there something in us that makes us believe this illusion? So if you make an action, there's a feeling like you chose to make this action. Think about it. Neuroscience has studied this a little bit. The better our technology becomes, the better our understanding of our brain. Okay, so the neurons firing sets off a weak electrical signal. If several neurons fire at the same time, the electrical signal it gives off is a lot bigger. And we are able to measure these electrical signals using ECG, which pick up these weak impulses. And we've found impulses or whatever that show up on these graphs that the ECG gives off can correlate with a behaviour or a certain thought or some process going on in the brain. The most obvious ones is ECG taken during sleep, and each stage of sleep has a different brainwave pattern. Of course, we don't really know what the brainwaves mean apart from its neurons synchronously firing. Neurons. Okay, so what Libet's group has done is use this ECG technique, and while measuring participants' brainwaves, he's asked them to, when they feel like it, move their hand. And what he's found is a readiness potential. So there'll be a spike in the brainwave just about a few milliseconds before the person actually moves their hand. So what Libet's conclusion was is that you make an unconscious decision first before it rises up and you feel like making a conscious decision. And of course, they took it further. Not only do you make the decision to move your hand, but which side of the hand, like left or right, are you going to move? But also criticisms of this study have said that this is not conscious will you're measuring, it's the attention made So what's being measured is that people have to make an attention shift from the internal thinking to the external hand or the clock or the whatever. But it also gets interesting. This is where everyone can be a shadow priest. Yes, mind control. Okay, so in a previous study, it was found that right-handed people just picked to move their right hand 60% of the time. Now they used transcranial magnetic stimulation on a part of the brain, and then after this was done, it was found that the participants chose to move their hand 80% of the time. So that's 20% more. And they didn't feel like they were forced to or anything. They felt like they have chosen to move that hand themselves. Like I've done transcranial magnetic stimulation, part of an experiment on my motor cortex, and when you do it there, it's definitely a twitch. You can't control moving your hand. They did it in the frontal lobe. That's the decision-making part. Kind of. That's a whole nother issue. But I thought that was interesting. But then again, what happened to that last 20% where they moved their left hand instead? Well, it was said that you can make a conscious decision to stop moving your hand, and that was called the free won't. That makes sense in a variety of disorders and the way the brain works. So how the free won't works is basically you don't really have control of your actions. You respond externally, and there's too many external factors, so it looks like it's an illusion of free will. But what you can actually do is stop yourself from doing something. The general principle of how this works, I'll give you an example. When you do strength training, you do almost immediately become stronger by a certain degree. Now this isn't because you've actually grown more muscle immediately. It's because you've gotten rid of a few connections and made it more precise. So you've made inhibitions. So there's your free won't in a muscle system occurring. Also, when you want to make a purposeful action, be kicking a ball, what the brain does is inhibit every other action you could do with that leg to only let that one go through. It's because in the basal ganglia, the centre for movement in the brain, you have a direct pathway, which is the excitation of a muscle, and you also have the indirect pathway, which stops unwanted muscle contractions. So you have the direct pathway facilitating the one movement, whereas you have the indirect pathway blocking everything else off. In Parkinson's disorder, you have degeneration of the basal ganglia and neurons of the pathway which are involved in the direct pathway. So you have too much indirect pathway and not enough direct pathway, and that leads to difficulty in making wheeled movements. So you will see often rigid. So with Parkinson's, you'll often see a lot of rigidity, especially in gait or their walking. Then you also have Huntington's disorder, which is kind of the opposite thing. You have a lot more direct pathway and not enough indirect pathway happening. So you're moving all over the way. That's why it's called Huntington's chorea, because you're like, ooh, and you're making uncontrolled movements that are unwheeled. If we go further up the cognitive tree, we get Tourette syndrome. So with Tourette's, you get tics. They might be motor tics, or they might be stereotypical swearing that you see in the media. Whatever. What's interesting about Tourette's is that the people with it report that they are able to an extent, control the tics. Like they can feel one building up and they can hold it back. But holding it back costs psychic energy. So this is some sort of discomfort that they feel in holding back a tic. Then you go up and you go to the thought disorders. Now, if you haven't had a mental illness, you might not understand what it's like, because we all may feel like our thinking itself is our own, but depression, anxiety, OCD, schizophrenia, what these all, even anorexia, what these all have in common is that you have some sort of a thought that's pathological. I use OCD as an example because it's a nice and obvious one. You have your obsessions, and they're thought to be sort of intrusive thoughts. So someone with OCD thinks of things they don't really want to think of, and it makes them anxious. And they do compulsions in order to stop this thinking. For an example, someone with OCD might be afraid that they forgot to lock the door, and they keep thinking, have I locked the door? Have I locked the door? That's the obsessive thought. The compulsion is, of course, to check, yeah, I locked the door. But then it comes back, have I really checked that door? Check it again. Okay. What about if it wasn't really locked? And it goes on like that. So, is obsessive compulsive there? Is the compulsion, was that a free will? Was the obsession, is that a thought made out of free will? So, can a thought feel alien to us? So, we feel like our thinking is our own, but can we ever feel like someone else has implanted a thought there? Schizophrenics often think this way. So yeah, they think someone has actually implanted a thought into their head, or they're being mind controlled or something. On the outside, it just may seem like another delusion. But sidetracking a little bit, there's a disorder called alien hand syndrome or alien limb syndrome, where after a stroke or some sort of damage to a region of the brain called the corpus callosum, which connects our two hemispheres, it might feel like, for someone with syndrome, that their hand has their own will. So it doesn't feel like the hand belongs to them anymore, but it's just attached to them. So just going back to before about how Parkinson's and Huntington's works, and how we have readiness potentials, it seems there is some sort of generator that our movement is our own. It gives us free will. This is called proprioception. We have a sense called proprioception. So it is a sense of where body parts are in relation to each other. And we use it, and we can feel that we make our own movement with it. The senses are located in muscle spindles, muscles, and there's between the tendons as well. So what would be interesting is, gathering from that information, what if there's alien thought syndrome, so a subset of schizophrenia, where there is something wrong with our free will feeling generators that can cause this? I wonder, with all these feedback and feed-forward systems and everything that the brain has in place, it's all very complex and very easy for something to go wrong. It seems like when everything goes right, that's probably our perception of free will, when everything's in balance. But if something goes out of place, then perhaps we feel like we've lost our sense of free will right there, causing a variety of disorders. I mean, that's just all a new idea that I've had. I don't really know much about it. If you have more information, please comment and give me more information. It would be lovely. But I do think that if we don't really have free wills, and that if it's an illusion, like neuroscience seems to be pointing us in that direction, then there must be something that gives us a feeling that we have a free will. Some sort of mechanism, something, anything. It's got to be there. And as the behaviourists have already said, looking at something is very complicated and almost untestable. So we won't really know the answer until sometime in the future. But in conclusion, just because we could possibly come up with the causality for our behaviours, both external and internal, doesn't mean that we shouldn't take responsibility. Can't just say, oh, my brain did it, because the problem is, in the end, we are our brains. All these decisions or whatever, it's still us. It doesn't change anything really. So that's like time travel. For example, if you go see what you do in the future and then come back again, what you decide to do might change based on what you saw on the future. So you might alter the future that way, as you see in many movies. Same with your behaviour. If you know what behaviour you're going to do, then you might change that behaviour because of knowledge of what you're going to do. And then you end up not knowing what you do. So that's just another factor added in to the complicatedness. Well, that's basically it from me. But there's so much more to go on about, such as the issue of brainwashing or different levels of free will. You know, when you're drunk, maybe you have less free will than you're sober. It might not be you have free will or you don't. And it could go on and on and on. But, zip it. So, catch you later.